I'm an OC artist on YouTube, so it's time for my contractually obligated video about artfight. Yay! In case you don't know, artfight is an art gifting event where there are 2 teams, although this year we got 3, competing to see who can rack up the most points. You gain points by attacking other artists, creating something with their OCs. How much you earn depends on the quality and effort you put into your piece, and to encourage targeting artists on the opposite team, friendly fire is rated differently. I think now you only receive 75% of the points you would have been rewarded, but the percentage used to be much lower. Rest assured, I'm not going to talk about any dramas or controversies. Other people have already covered those topics, and I'm also the least qualified person to cover them. Instead, I'll be talking about how I used this event to combat art block. I tried to do the same thing last year, but I had a really hard time, and while I did manage to make 5 attacks, I didn't really enjoy myself. In fact, I was so discouraged by how things went for me last year that I almost didn't participate this time around. But I had a couple friends convince me. I also realized I didn't really have an idea for a July video. One thing I didn't do last time was set clear goals for myself. So this time, I decided on 4 things I want to improve on with my art and put them on a wheel. Hello. I'm recording this before I have even written a script, so forgive me if I sound kind of all over the place. Why is line art in here twice? Anyway, I am only going to be talking about the different things on the wheel and why I picked them. Starting with color. I really like coloring. It's my favorite part of the art process, I think, but I feel like lately I haven't been allowing myself to really explore that, or I haven't been making a lot of decisions with my color palettes, where typically, if I'm drawing a specific character, which is generally the case, I color pick off of the reference, and then I color everything else, if there's like a background or whatever, something close to what would be considered quote unquote realistic, and then I use a multiply layer or other color layers like overlay and things like that to shade. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. That's the process that I have been using that works for me, that is quick and efficient, but I feel like I have not had as much control over the appearance of the colors in the final product as much as I would like. I also feel like as a result, my color choices aren't that interesting. I really admire pieces that have very striking color palettes, especially those that make excellent use of contrast between desaturated / muted colors versus vibrant accent or focal points. So that's something that I want to work on more just in general. The next thing, line art. I hate line art. I hate line art so much, but I like the appearance of line art. I could be like 90% of artists who hate line art and just avoid it by skipping to the painterly stage and things like that. However, for me personally, I just don't think that work process works for me. My sketches are far too messy to work off of, and I like how practical it is to have a sort of set line art. It makes coloring easier. It clarifies the image. I just prefer that. And I also don't like painting very much. I can do it. I think I just prefer doing line art and the look of line art than painting, for me personally. So that's why it's there. I want to be able to try different things. And hopefully at the end of this, I will find a style of line art that I not only like to look at, but also enjoy doing. Next thing, background. I don't draw backgrounds very much. I'm not very good at them. But as a comic artist and an illustrator in general who likes, making narrative images, so to speak, being able to put a character in a space or being able to communicate something about a space in general is something that's really interesting that I want to be less scared of doing. So that's why it's there. Second to last one. Oh, wait, I did just put line art twice. What? Anyway, proportions. There's a little asterisk there because proportions themselves is not the thing that I am interested in tackling, by which I mean the accuracy of proportions. I don't care about necessarily making realistic anatomy or accurate anatomy. I want to try and push the proportionality of my characters a little more, because I feel like with my vaguely semi-realistic art style, I'm playing things very safe. I'm trying to stick too hard to reality. And as a result, oftentimes I end up feeling like my figures look kind of stiff when I try too hard to make things look quote unquote proportional or evenly balanced, but in like the very standard, I want to say, conventionally appealing way, you know? So I want to try exploring different ways of pushing proportions or finding a more interesting balance that obviously still appeals to me, but is more expressive. I think that's what I am looking for. So yeah, I'm not going to film myself every time I spin the wheel, but this is just to illustrate an example. It's what is it? It's the 8th of July right now. So we'll see what I'm going to focus on for today's piece. Okay. All right, that's fun. All right, so yeah, that's basically it. I spin wheel, I pick art, fight, attack, and then I focus entirely on the thing that I spun the wheel on, or by which I mean I focus on trying something different, and then everything else will just be comfort zone stuff for me. So I'm focusing on proportions. I don't have to draw background. I'm focusing on proportions. I don't have to think too hard about the colors. That's the premise. Yeah, I don't know how to segue this into the next part because I did not write the script, which wasn't smart. So other constraints that I had given myself were that I had 4 hours to work on my attacks, which also included concepting. The most planning I could do outside of that is collect reference photos, and that I had to finish at least 1 attack a day. Did I actually manage to abide by the rules I had set for myself? Not really, but I'll get into that after I share my process for every single one of the attacks I made. Because it took me so long to really get into the swing of things, I only ended up doing revenges. So before presenting my illustration and the things I learned while making it, I'll showcase the art I received from the artist I'm revenging. Their links will be available in the description, so if any of them caught your eye, I encourage you to check them out. The first attack I received is from Lou Stars. I have her Instagram alongside her art fight linked in the description. She drew my Genshin OCs Malachi and Carmelo. I really like the moody lighting and their expressions. The dialogue also really fits their characters. The way that they're positioned and framed gave me a really strong impression of this being like a screenshot of a really intimate moment from a show. Then, she later also drew my character Alejandro. The background is animated with bright flashing colors. I'm gonna let it play for a bit, then display a still image for the rest of the segment to avoid too much eye strain. Anyway, they're drawn super cute here. I love her expression and how his hair is drawn especially. Given my limited time and energy, I couldn't retaliate both times, but I'm super thankful to have received 2 attacks from her. On to my one revenge. This was the one I recorded myself spinning on the wheel, and you might be surprised to hear that I posted it way later than when I said I intended to work on it. That's due to a series of inconveniences, starting with my wrist hurting again. The pain flares up from time to time, so it's not really alarming, more so a pain in the ass. I let myself rest for the remainder of the week, then tried to bust out a drawing on Monday, but I couldn't. That's because I hadn't yet fully learned my lesson from last year. I was more focused on the end product, on making something that looked different without actually exploring new or different methods to get me there. I was struggling to find a worthwhile concept, struggling to apply any meaningful changes to my style, and struggling to enjoy the process. Everything I did felt completely aimless. I got as far as the flat colors and realized no amount of polish was going to pretty up my turd, so I decided to stop for the day and spend the rest of the week working on other things, like my Kofi tier chibis, which I'll feature at the end of the video. Back to the topic at hand, besides being frustrated with the drawing, I was also frustrated with myself. Had I not evolved at all since last year? Why was I still having the same issues? I thought to myself that I shouldn't be having such a hard time because I wasn't doing anything particularly difficult, which was when I realized that was exactly the issue. When I tried again, I went in with clearer priorities. I started off by drawing the character as I would normally, doing both a full body and a face. Then I went on to see how I might be able to stylize their proportions a little more intentionally, like trying to give her an overall more triangular shape by making her flared pants really wide at the bottom while keeping the upper half relatively narrow. To keep her from feeling too bottom heavy, I decided to draw her hair with a little more volume so she still looked balanced overall. I then went on to pick a really simple but dynamic pose so I could focus on the proportions without her looking like a stiff NPC. While the end result doesn't stray drastically from my usual art style, the process was completely different. I had so much fun getting to really pay attention to the character and trying to find ways to push things a little without straying too far from her original vibe. Speaking of the character, this is Mary June. I picked her because I found her really cute. Her outfit is is super simple and appealing, and I adore these shades of blue. I find they especially complement her warm skin and hair really well. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a little while before you see it in the speed paint, but I wanted to include some sort of reference to her interest in marine biology. So I drew little lemon sharks framing her. That's all I have to say for my piece, but to avoid having to speed up the drawing footage to the point of it being completely unwatchable, I'll let the rest of it play to some background music. But there are timestamps in the description if you're more interested in hearing about the next attack. My next piece technically isn't a revenge because he didn't attack me this year, but last year, Kasarian drew my character Alejandro. This was before the Cyberpunk reboot, so while it unfortunately no longer reflects their design, I still really like this piece. I like his expression, the overall warmth of the image, and how his face stands out surrounded by the mostly lineless hair and shirt. I didn't manage to retaliate before the end of the event back then, so I'm doing it now. I drew his character Nico because he posted on Blue Sky, where you should check it out, encouraging people to draw them for ArtFight, and who am I to deny my lovely mutual? Besides that, I also genuinely really like Nico's design. I love her big fluffy tail and ears, his outfit is really cute, I love femme-presenting gender things, and also, moon-themed characters are my weakness. I love the moon. The wheel told me to focus on colors, so I started off by doing a little doodle mapping out the colors on the reference to see what I wanted to highlight. I waffled around a bit and did a first attempt where I tried to highlight the silver in its design, but ultimately felt it would be more eye-catching if I focused on the orange. Get it? Because it's the eye color. I decided to try out a split complementary color scheme, since I rarely ever do limited color palettes, and I've never tried anything beyond the simple 2-color complementary. There are all kinds of tools out there to help you map out the exact 2 shades to be a perfect complementary to this hex code of orange, but I just eyeballed it. After color picking the eye color, I looked at what was on the opposite end of the wheel, then picked the 2 hues next to it. Color theory doesn't have to be scary and complicated. A lot of it is just vibes. Anyway, I drew them doing a cute little rawr pose, added some moon phases in the background, and got to work mapping out the colors. While I could have easily used a gradient map to translate her usual color scheme to this new one, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be really intentional with my colors, so I picked everything myself. This raised the challenge of having to translate all these warm tones into blues. So to avoid accidentally making something too light or too dark, I frequently checked my values. I didn't want to match them 1-to-1 because this is supposed to be kind of like a night scene, but I used relativity to keep things consistent. For instance, I know that the skin is lighter than the shirt and that the shirt is lighter than the hip fabric, sleeves, and belt. I hope that made sense, but if not, maybe the speed paint visualizes what I mean clearly enough. Sometimes I used adjustment layers to shift the brightness or hue at certain points. I remember near the end I felt like something was off, and it was because my color distribution was a little all over the place. If I had to break it down, I wanted it to be 60% royal blue, 30% that turquoise aqua color, and 10% the orange. Things were looking a little too green, so I used the color balance filter to bring in more of the blue. Anyway, in the end, I liked how it turned out and learned a lot in the process. This next attack is from wiwiiyum, who you can find on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky. He drew my character Donnie. I love the simple and sketchy rendering. It really gives a sense of weight and texture to his clothing, as well as directing the eyes to focal points like his face. He also just perfectly captured Donnie's vibe. He looks like your cool, chill uncle who will take you to Jollibee just cuz. One small thing that I absolutely adore are the tan lines. It's not something I included in my reference, but I am 1000% incorporating it into his character. For my revenge, I drew his character Dee Dee. I found her design really eye-catching, in part because she's real freaky looking, which I love, but also because I really liked her color palette. The purples look really striking against her yellowish green skin. Because her design is so different from what I usually draw, she was also pushing me a little in terms of stylization. But the thing that I rolled on the wheel was color. You might notice I have a few references to the side, which are from comic artist and illustrator David Sella. I had recently read his comic adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and was drawn in by his use of colors and stylization. I felt like it would make a good source of inspiration for my piece. Obviously, it's not a one-to-one copy of what he did. Hell, you might not even be able to tell that his art was an influence if I didn't outright say it, but it did help guide my thought process. I was especially inspired by a panel of Frankenstein surrounded by bodies, and wanted my piece to have a similar vibe. I went with a scene where Dee Dee's doing some ominous magic, with undead hands coming from below, grasping at her. To avoid awkward negative spaces in the composition, I put a floating magic skull in front of her, as though she were using it to channel her magic. As for whether or not she's actually capable of doing anything like this, I don't know. I took creative liberties here. To keep everything looking cohesive, I gave the undead hands a similar green and purple overall color palette, and I kept the rendering pretty simple as to not outshine the character. I think this ended up being more about rendering and lighting than color, as I probably could have pushed things a little more in that department, but I'm still proud of how it turned out overall. This attack is from Elgat, who you might recognize from my collaboration video about OCs and gender. He drew Benilda, and she looks perfect. Her pose and expression perfectly convey a quiet, tortured feeling that works so well for her character. The shade of red for the background and the lighting also give this image an overall intensity that contrasts really well with the subtlety of her emotion. I rolled background for this revenge, and I was concerned. Besides not having a lot of practice drawing them, I was also worried about my ability to come up with ideas for scenes. In a pinch, I could do nature stuff, but that wouldn't really challenge me, as I feel like I can fudge the details in a nature scene a lot more easily than if I drew an interior or an urban setting. I wanted to be conscious of the world and personalities of the character I was drawing, but due to my lack of skill, I wasn't totally confident in being able to make that up completely from scratch. Luckily for me, one of their characters, Ray, featured a reference depicting him in a scene. It looked to be a store, but his profile didn't specify what kind, so I took a lot of creative liberties when expanding the interior. I went with the angle that it was an indie media store that sold books, games, music, movies, and even some secondhand clothes. I collected a few references of real-life store interiors, as well as an illustration by Coconut and Manny.oe. I don't know about my pronunciation for that one, but both on Instagram, with the vibe I vaguely want to replicate. You might have also noticed that I had a bunch of other character references besides Ray, which is because I felt like it would be more interesting if I populated the space a little. So I picked out 4 more characters from other art YouTubers. Grimm's character Mercedes, Maddie's character Farah, Snowbird's character Erin, and Jade's character Fiona. I managed to pick characters who happen to have some overlapping interests, so in my piece, I wanted Ray and Erin to be talking about music, with Mercedes listening in, while Farah and Fiona talked about sewing or designing outfits/costumes somewhere else in the store. To avoid feeling overwhelmed, I tackled every step of this illustration in steps. I started by figuring out the layout of the store's interior from a top-down perspective, like a floor plan. Then I took that floor plan and tried to draw it in an isometric perspective so I could get a better sense of the scale of everything in the room. Only then did I actually start sketching for the illustration itself, starting from a thumbnail that I later scaled up to act as guidelines for a more detailed sketch. You might be wondering why I'm not making use of a perspective grid, and that's because I'm a comic artist. If I have to fully map out a bunch of grids every time I wanted to draw anything in perspective, I would sooner make every panel an empty void. I want to be able to vibe out the perspective. Of course, my ability to fudge things would improve greatly if I did practice with grids more often, but this is my very first background of this challenge and I wanted an easy start. Just so we're clear, I'm not entirely inexperienced at drawing perspective either. I went to art school. I had dedicated classes for perspective and observation drawing. Don't use this as a metric for what you should be able to do with zero or little practice because it's not accurate. Anyway, at this point, I was starting to feel a little overwhelmed. So I took a break. Spoilers, I didn't adhere to the 4-hour time limit for this one. The accumulated drawing time is about 6 hours, but it really took me the entire afternoon until late into the evening to finish this piece. I'll talk about discipline in regards to art and whether or not this counts as a failure for my challenge later. After my break, I once again divided the things I needed to do into smaller, more digestible steps. Rather than line out everything on a single layer as is usually my process, I treated the foreground, midground, and background like separate pieces, which also facilitated the process of coloring later down the line. From then on, I started to get into overtime. I could have left everything at flat colors and called it a day, but I resolved to see it through to the end, because I figured I would learn more if I did. I didn't think too hard on the flats, which I think ended up being to my detriment. I just color picked directly from the reference whenever I could and eyeballed the rest. I did have a lot of fun drawing the various covers of vinyls, magazines, DVD cases, and what have you. Sometimes I had reasons for referencing something, like sneaking in one of the art tubers' sonas, but especially for things like the vinyls that took up a lot of space, to avoid spending too much time thinking about what to put there, I looked up pictures of record stores and just copied what I saw on the displays. The flats look fine, but they do lack cohesion. I could have done a better job at conveying a specific atmosphere if I had been more intentional with the colors. This problem then gets exacerbated in the shading. I tried to keep things simple, using multiply and overlay layers to shade, but things just got really muddy. I tried using gradient maps to add more vibrancy to the image, but it just wasn't working. I ended up pulling everything back and using exclusively exclusively the overlay layer to shade, so that everything would stay vibrant and nothing would get too dark. I did do a very basic value breakdown in the sketch phase, but I probably should have explored that a little further. As it stands now, the lighting in the room looks really ambiguous, and you wouldn't even know there's supposed to be a large storefront window, or I'm otherwise implying they're all doing their shopping at night for some reason. Also, because of my use of overlay layers, the colors of certain things ended up changing pretty drastically. Like the shelves are now a bright red/orange, while the boxes in the center, which were once the same colors as the boxes on the shelves, became a really dark desaturated brown. It's not an entirely bad thing, since it does help further separate the midground from the background, but it wasn't done on purpose. I won't lie and say that I'm 100% satisfied with the result, but I learned a lot from this piece and it made me more willing to tackle interior pieces in the future. This next attack that I received is from my friend Claire, or Libation on Artfight and Instagram. She made an absolutely breathtaking watercolor piece that's sort of a redraw of an old illustration I made of these same characters, Induran and Lucia. It's so romantic looking. The way everything is drawn and rendered reminds me of Art Nouveau, giving the piece a really graceful and tender feeling. I always admire the way that she stylizes people, and this is no exception. Induran and Lucia contrast each other a lot by design, and Claire really takes advantage of that by making Lucia look extra willowy and Induran powerful, but in a sturdy, reliable way, if that makes sense. Anyway, I was really happy to have gotten proportions for this one because my desire to push my stylization largely comes from her. That said, I didn't want to just copy her art, so I went looking for references. At first, I thought I would go the angle of pushing the perspective, so I got references from TZ Bard and Irie Pan that had a similar intensely foreshortened ground-up perspective. Then I remembered artist Robert Valley, who has a really recognizable style, and picked up a lot of references from him. As for which of Claire's OCs I chose to draw, I picked Lenka and Eugenio because I liked how much their designs contrasted from one another. I started off by doing really simple sketches of the two, the way I would draw them instinctively. Originally, I wanted to go straight into trying to stylize them when I remembered that while having references was good, actually studying them was better. So I copied some of the images to get a better feel for how Robert Valley chooses to exaggerate anatomy. Ideally, when doing studies, you would do more than just 3 sketches and extend your practice over a longer period of time, rather than speedrun everything in a single drawing session. But I was doing Artfight, not a dedicated artist study. So I went straight into trying to apply what I managed to pick up with my quick copies. It definitely did help a lot that Claire already likes to exaggerate the shapes of her characters so much. I wasn't so much pushing the anatomy of the characters as I was pushing my own style to be closer to what she usually does. It would have been more interesting to apply this level of stylization to a character that isn't already so obviously shape heavy, but considering I don't have much practice with this way of drawing, it functions as a nice jumping off point. While I intended from the beginning to do a drawing with a ground up perspective, I did still consider what a top down view would look like. I ultimately still went with my initial plan because I really wanted to use a more vertical canvas and felt that I could achieve that more easily with the worm's eye view. I still had a bit of trouble actually fitting them into a narrower canvas when I remembered exaggeration doesn't stop at how I draw the characters. I placed Eugenio directly in front of Lenka's legs, so while the perspective isn't accurate, the height difference is completely fudged and he's not even looking directly at her, it better sells the feeling of her towering over him. I won't talk too much about the colors because they're nothing special. I slapped some gradients on them and put some intense lighting to make the image pop with minimal shading. I will say that I lost some of the stylization, especially in Eugenio, because of the perspective. It's not really a surprise since it was kind of ambitious of me to think I could do foreshortening in a style I don't typically draw, but I'm overall really happy with the composition and how things turned out. I found the process really enjoyable, and while I still feel like I played things really safe, I can learn to push things more over time. This attack is from my friend Andromeda, or AJJordanDraws on Artfight, Tumblr, and Instagram. They drew my beloved baby Aika. I will talk about her on this channel one day, this is a threat. Anyway, they redrew her in the style of a pinup, which I like a lot. I also know that they don't typically do lineless, so I like that they experimented with that here. The mix of flat colors and certain rendered parts helps draw the eye up to the face. For my revenge, I drew their OC Haruka, because most of the other ones I already drew or am in the process of drawing for commissions. This one kind of got away from me. The focus was color, and as a reference, I chose certain story illustrations from Zenless Zone Zero. I wanted to try emulating the vibrancy and color variation, though I ended up spending a lot more time on the composition and line art than the colors. First of all, it took me a couple tries to really nail the pose and perspective. Then I spent so long on the line art because I had the marvelous idea of using a really thin brush. This one also ended up going over the 4-hour time limit. I actually spent multiple days working on it bit by bit. I think it was due to a sort of mental block. I hadn't exactly figured out how I wanted to handle the coloring. In the references I have, it was all very clearly painterly, but I didn't want to paint anything. Plus, having already spent so much time on the sketching and line art, I didn't want to spend even more time rendering. So I tried my best to simplify the process as much as possible. I noticed one of the reasons the color popped so much was because of how strong the lighting was. There were clearly defined shapes separating light and shadow and no soft edges. So I quickly mapped out the values to clearly define how the lights and shadows would look. I put the rough value map on the side as a reference and made a cleaner version, keeping each value on a separate layer so I could easily select them. So I knew how I wanted to shade the piece, but that didn't help me pick the colors. If I tried individually adjusting the colors, how could I guarantee that they would still look cohesive? How would I be able to coordinate the color variations within every individual element? I wasn't getting anywhere overthinking things, so I just went ahead and tried stuff. On some new layers, I used the shapes I had defined in black and white to turn the lighting into colorful gradients. The lights tending towards warm pinks and the shadows towards cool teals and blues. I only had to lower the opacity a bit to get the lighting effect across while unifying the color palette and grounding the character in the scene. To add some extra variation, on a separate layer, I manually picked the colors and painted in more details. I was almost disappointed at how anticlimactic the solution ended up being, but I'm ultimately really happy with the result, and it gave me a new coloring method that I wanted to experiment with further. This attack wasn't made specifically for me, but it does include my character Aika. Kazim, who you can also find on Tumblr, made a Genshin Impact mass attack that emulates the character selection / viewing menu. It's such a fun concept. You can see my baby in the bottom left corner. She looks really cute and I'm endeared to her little smile. It's also fun to see just how much you can get away with stripping her details while keeping her recognizable. This was my second background piece. Having just went overtime on the last attack, I was determined to stay within the 4-hour time limit, so I told myself I would keep things as loose as possible. Looking at Kazim's profile, I saw his character, Kazim. Seeing the connections to Portal on his character sheet, I remember how striking the environments were, especially in the second game when things were falling apart. So I collected a bunch of Portal screenshots and concept art as reference. Just so that the character wouldn't be alone, I also decided to include his little traffic cone creatures. The thing about the environments in Portal is that they can get really detailed. I did not have the time or energy to figure out how to draw that myself. Rather than replicate the things I saw, I tried to communicate the general feeling I got when looking at them, which was of a liminal space that's breaking down. I started off with an isometric corner, just 2 walls and a floor, and started taking chunks out of it. Then I started placing a bunch of random slabs, room pieces, to fill out the empty space. To keep things from being too simple, I also decided to include a bunch of stairs. It didn't matter so much to me that the perspective and geometry was super messed up, partially because it lends itself to the feeling I was going for with this piece, but also because I wanted to save time. Once I had the general layout of the space, I added in the characters and got to coloring. I really wanted to make an effort with the coloring since I wasn't totally satisfied with the way I handled things in my last background piece. I decided to make use of the technique that I had learned while working on my Revenge for Andromeda, but I unexpectedly ended up hitting a roadblock. I had no idea how the shadow would look in the central area. You can, or will, see me struggle a lot. For some reason, I just couldn't wrap my head around how the left wall's shadow would fall on the other surfaces. It would have been really nice if I knew Blender, so I could make a 3D mock-up of the space and use that as a lighting reference, but I didn't have the time to learn a new program just for this attack. So naturally, I made a mock-up in real life and took a picture in the bathroom with the lights off using a flashlight to recreate my light source. This isn't the only time I use my own picture references for my attacks, but the other two are pictures of myself, and I don't feel like putting those on the internet. Anyway, from then on, the lighting went really smoothly. I made the background a dark void, like space, which decided that the elements that were further back would be darker. For the foreground element, you can only go so bright before getting too close to white, but I needed to find a way to push things further to distinguish it from the midground. I ended up putting a soft blur on the edges facing the light source, the way really bright light sometimes diffuses in the air, even though they're in space and there's no air particles to cause that lighting effect. Cheating physics to make things look good is all par for the course with art. Anyway, I messed around a lot with filters like curves and color balance, frequently checking the values in black and white. I also did a few touch-ups and added a bit of texture, as well as colored all the line art more vibrantly so it would stand out against the dark background. Even though the background is really simple, especially compared to the reference images I had pulled up, I'm still really proud of the results. I feel like I really got to redeem myself with the colors, and now have a better idea of how to tackle drawings with backgrounds overall. BrodieBeeBumbles on Artfight and YouTube redrew my Genshin OCD as the Brazilian woman math meme. It's really good, they're the best candidate of all my characters for this meme, and I really like how she drew him. He looks very pretty. For this revenge and the two that follow, I focused on line art. When looking at her profile, Faith caught my eye, especially her last design. What can I say? I think buff older ladies are pretty cool. Anyway, because of the cape in her design, I decided to try emulating Witch Hat Atelier's manga style, which is iconic for its texture and detail, especially the way the mangaka draws flowing, drapey fabric. This was certainly an inspired choice on my part, because not only am I not the best at line art, I also don't have a lot of practice when it comes to drawing flowy fabrics. To top things off, it was around 11 p.m. on August 1st when I started working on this one. Since most of the character in Witch Hat's line art comes from the hatching, I started by lining the piece as I would normally. Once that was done, I started to add the hatching, and boy did I lose my mind a little. I'm not a very patient artist, so having to go section by section, paying attention to keep my line weight and distance even, but not so even that it looked stiff, really forced me to take my time. I would often feel myself wanting to rush the hatching, but then I'd mess up the things I had just listed, so I had to take frequent breaks and pace myself so the quality of the line art didn't drop in random places. To not detract from the line work, I opted for flat colors with a couple gradients and some highlights on the metal bits to make them pop. While I'm far too impatient for this style of line art, I really enjoy the weight and texture it gives to the image. I personally don't like when my art looks too smooth, so there may be elements of this that I want to adapt into my own style. This attack of my darling Aika is from Starberry Inc., also on YouTube and Kara. They made her look so cute but sinister, highlighting her little snake features like the slit pupils, forked tongue, and her little fangs. I love the expression and dramatic lighting, it fits her perfectly. For my second line art focused piece, I decided to reference Mike Mignola's art, another artist with a super iconic lining style. You'd think it'd be easier because it's just solid black shading, but I think I actually had a harder time with this one than with Witch Hat's style. Starberry Inc. has two characters on their profile. I picked the one whose design and attitude appealed to me more, drew a simple pose, and like last time, started lining as normal. When it was time for me to add the black shadows, I had a really rough time. Rather than communicate the volumes of the character, I felt like I was flattening them. I had no idea what my actual light source was, and I couldn't find the right balance between the shadows and unshaded parts. At this point, it was around 2 a.m. and I had 2 more attacks to draw, so I had to settle on something. I added some colors on the edges of the character for a little rim lighting, then made made the background black with a cutout to imply a light source, emulating what I would see in Mignola's art. While I'm not totally satisfied with how this came out, I still really like how I drew and posed the character. Plus, it showed me how much I could really benefit from practicing my volumes a little more. This attack is from Aka Art, who drew Benilda. They drew her so gorgeous, and I really like the pose. She looks like a fashion model. Her makeup looks so nice, and something about the shading makes her look expensive to me, like a porcelain doll. A rather specific thing I appreciate are the legs. The heel especially looks really good. I don't know about you, but I struggle a lot to draw shoes. It can be really difficult to make them look appealing at this angle, and it looks so nice here. Anyway, this would be my last line art focus piece for Artfight, but I didn't have any artists, comics, or illustrations that immediately popped to mind to use as reference. So I went looking into my saved arts folder on Instagram and found this illustration by, and forgive my pronunciation, JJordanDraws. I really liked how minimal the usage of lines are here, only defining details like the face and the hair framing it, while the rest of the body is mostly implied. I think it's really cool how the brain can fill in the missing information, so I wanted to try something similar. I chose to draw Aka's character, Yana, just because I found her really pretty. I drew her in a simple but elegant pose, making sure there would be overlapping elements with her arms. I got to use her shoulder bag to imply the arm tucking her hair behind her ear, and placed a shadow by her chest to distinguish her torso from the arm resting on her bag. I still wanted to include color, but I decided not to shade anything to keep an overall graphic feeling. I still gave her a little blush to make her feel alive and draw attention to the face. I chose to make the background the same sort of lilac color as her pants, as it really made her warm skin and light yellow shirt pop, and added a noise filter for a bit of texture. It's super simple, but I really like how this one turned out. Because of how much I rely on line art and enjoy dramatic lighting, I'm not sure how much I'll be able to get away with stuff like this in future pieces, but it's something to play around with. The last attack I received this year was from Clovers in Notebooks, also on Tumblr. He drew Benilda, Induran, and Lucia's arm, and they all look so pretty. I love Induran and Benilda's poses. They look so lively, and he did a really good job at interpreting Lucia's arm, given how loose I was with the details on her ref sheet. For this final revenge, I ruled proportions, but I honestly didn't focus too much on that. It was 6 AM and this was my last piece for Artfight, so I just wanted to make something that looked cool. I was drawn to his character Ellie, who happens to be a Fear and Hunger Termina OC. I'm too much of a baby to play Fear and Hunger games myself, but I've watched a few videos about the lore and I always found the aesthetic really striking. Ellie's reference also included a moon-scorched form for her, so I wanted to illustrate both that and her regular design. I absolutely locked in for this one. I had an idea for an illustration right away, and the process of drawing everything was a breeze. I entered a flow state I feel like I had not experienced in ages, and I knocked out this drawing in just an hour. I was so proud of how this piece turned out. In a span of about 2 weeks, I managed to do 11 attacks. And while not all of them were a home run, I felt like I learned a lot and actually enjoyed myself this time around. Since this video is probably already super long, I'm going to keep this wrap-up segment pretty brief. Did I fail my personal art fight challenge? Let's take my constraints one by one. Did I complete every attack in 4 hours? No, I went overtime on 2 of them. Did I draw daily? No, I only managed to keep that up for 3 days. Hell, did I even respect the results of the wheel? Not really, because if I did always go for the first result it gave me, nearly all of my attacks would have been focused on colors. By those metrics, I completely failed my challenge. But here's the thing, none of those things were my true goal. They were guidelines to support me as I worked towards what I really wanted to do, which was to push myself artistically. I drew 2 backgrounds, I experimented with line art and coloring styles, and for the first time in a while, I felt in tune with my process. Of course, in theory, it's easy to always move the goalpost to make every failure feel like a success, but between me and the guy who gave up completely because they couldn't keep up with their super rigid personal standards, who's actually drawing more? I like drawing. I'm supposed to enjoy what I'm doing. Who cares if I'm not doing it perfectly or optimally all the time? I speak strongly about this because I nearly sat out of art fight this year because of a personal belief of having poor discipline. How can I manage the drawings for my Ko-fi members alongside gifting art? What if I don't manage to attack or revenge anyone because I run out of steam? Fortunately, I decided to give it a go anyway and ended up having a really good time, as well as receiving some spectacular art of my OCs. Of course, I'm not saying everyone should participate in art fight or that the solution to burnout is brute forcing it. As evidenced by the fact that I didn't adhere to my draw every day rule, letting yourself rest is really valuable. My circumstances are also pretty different from last year. I have been unemployed for a full year now and had time to recover from my art thesis by reading, watching things, hanging out with my friends, and making videos. If you're feeling the way I did, directionless, like you've plateaued, or like you're not doing enough, I don't have a perfect solution for you. I mean, the thing that worked for me this year didn't pan out the first time I tried it. So I want to avoid giving generic advice like, be kind to yourself, or just do your best, because odds are you've heard that 100 times already. And if not, it doesn't sound very helpful. Don't get me wrong, I do want you to be kind to yourself and for you to just do your best, but having been on the receiving end of those kinds of platitudes, it takes a lot of time and effort to really let that sink in. So if anything, I hope sharing my experience gave you ideas to try new things, or showed you that failing or struggling, while a necessary part of the process, doesn't have to be scary or terrible. Okay, this video is probably a million years long, so I'll try to speedrun the outro. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching. I have a Ko-fi where I offer perks like having your name featured at the end of my videos, bonus videos, art critiques, and the possibility to influence my topics, like voting on polls, which I haven't at all gotten any use out of because I currently only have 2 members, and the last time I tried, they worked together to make a tie. At my highest tier, you can get chibi art. Here are the ones I made for Andromeda and Noel. If you like my art, you can follow me on Blue Sky and Instagram, and if you really like my art, I may have plans to open my commissions at some point in the near future. That's all. Thanks again, and I'll be back, I guess, at the end of this month.